Today we're talking about avoiding common mistakes. Generally, when we see common mistakes or people that run into the same confusion or errors, we'll try to make sure we adjust the system so that it's more clear, or that those people don't run into, or that people don't run into such errors. But that we still occasionally run into a few, despite our efforts to mitigate that confusion, and that's what we'll go over today. Okay. All right. So let's hop over to pipeline. And the first area that I wanted to go over, and a few of these first ones you've probably already heard me talk about in previous webinars, because again, we like to make sure that you're aware and don't fall into any particular pitfalls. So they might seem familiar to you, and then we'll get into some other ones you probably haven't heard of. So the first one I want to go over is if I head over to admin settings, I'm going to open that in a separate tab, and then our statuses, right? And you've heard me talk about this before. You want to be sure that when you're setting up your statuses, you make sure that anything that is in a closed or inactive status is in one of these three bottom categories: closed, fell through, or auto expiry. And if it is not closed, that it's in any of the others, right? Because once a transaction goes into one of these closed statuses, it triggers to the system to back up that transaction, as well as to not show that transaction on default transaction lists anymore. So again, you just want to be sure that the statuses that you set up are in the correct categories. For example, if I've got a leased status, meaning leased, L-E-A-S-E-D status, because I do property management or whatever, that's a closed status. And if I put it in other, it's going to keep showing up on default transaction lists. It's not going to get backed up, etc. Okay. So next thing I wanted to go over is also related to statuses. And what you want to be sure when you're setting up your statuses, you don't commingle them. Let me show you an example of how statuses can be commingled with your transaction label. Let me pull one up here. Right, so let's say I'm setting up my statuses and I've got pending, and I want to do pending for my commercial transactions and pending for my condos, pending for duplex, etc. I would not want to do them this way, because that's just repeating this information. And these are all of my transaction, these are all my transaction types, so they should be tracked via the transaction label, right? Where I set that once when I create the transaction, right? So I create a transaction, set it as commercial, then I don't have to deal with that anymore. That keeps my status, if I just have one status named pending, that keeps my status pure, so that when the status goes, the transaction goes through its different stages, I can just select pending and then closed or listed or whatever those particular statuses are, without having to actually go through each of these in order to determine that. Okay, so that's commingling with transaction labels. You don't want to do that. Also, we'll sometimes see statuses commingled with the side. Right, so instead of just saying under contract, it might say buyer under contract or seller under contract. There's no need to indicate the buyer or the seller, or whatever side of the transaction you've got. Maybe you've got dual sided. There's no need to indicate that in your status. Again, keeping that status pure, because sides are automatically detected by the system. Right, if you've got an agent on the listing side, it automatically knows it's a listing. If you've got it on the buyer side, it knows it's the buying. I'm sorry, buyer or seller. Okay. So that is commingling. You want to avoid that. Next, I wanted to go, let's hop over to a transaction here. Sometimes we'll see people who view the, let me cancel that there, who view the permission categories and think that it's really trying to define the doc, right? I've got a listing doc or a sale doc. Really, these permission categories are strictly to define who's going to have visibility to this doc, right? And you can determine that by looking at this little text on the side, which says if you put a doc in this particular category, it'll be visible to listing agents on the transaction and to office staff. If I put it in the sale docs, it'll be visible to listing and selling agents on this transaction and office staff, right? So anyone who's got access to view this transaction, any listing or selling agent who's got access to view this transaction will see docs that are in that section, and so on. Okay, so consider these permission categories, not doc, type of doc categories. Okay. Next, let me hop over to the transactions list. Sometimes we'll see people when they're downloading this spreadsheet here, either the 2019 or the 2018 spreadsheet, you'll have the last couple of years available here. They'll assume that that indicates the date that, let's say, the transaction closed, right? So all transactions closed in 2019 or all closed in 2018, or some other date, all that, you know, expired in 2018. These downloads represent all transactions added or created during that period. And then once you download it, then you can do whatever type of filter you want, like filter on close date or expiration date or anything you want once that download is completed. Cool. Next area I want to go over is heading back over to a transaction. When you are editing a transaction, you've got the option here called include this transaction name in November's backup. Sometimes people will think that they need to check that box for every transaction that they want to be backed up, but they don't. If you look at the little hover help over here, you can see that all transactions added during the month or closed, expired, canceled, or fell through or terminated basically become inactive during that month. So any that were added or became inactive during that month will automatically get included in the next month's backup. This option here, this checkbox, is only if you want to be sure to force this transaction to be backed up during the next month's backup because you don't think it is for whatever reason, right? So it's basically creating the option to allow you to force something to be backed up that wouldn't naturally be backed up. Okay. Next, I wanted to talk about new offer. We see a lot of confusion there. Because sometimes, let me back up, new offer basically allows you to create a duplicate of the listing, right? For whatever reason you need to. Typically that's because you've got a new offer on the transaction, but again, it's really just making a duplicate of the transaction. Sometimes we'll see people who use the new offer feature to create a new transaction for the first offer, right? But you don't need to do that because there's already this original transaction that existed for the property can house that first offer, right? You can store that first offer there. Then if you get any subsequent offers, then you can hit new offer to track any subsequent offers. Okay. So right now, for example, if I were to go ahead and do new offer right now, I've just created a new second offer for that. And I can toggle back to the original offer, right? I'm clicking that to toggle back to the original offer. And on this original offer, I've got can have multiple new offers on that. But again, the first offer can be housed in that original transaction. Okay. Next, staying on this transaction here, sometimes we'll see people who will add a comment to a doc, you know, missing signatures or whatever, right? And they'll save it. And then they'll send a message to that person to let them know, hey, you know, XYZ doc was missing signatures. But you don't need to do that because whenever an admin adds a comment to a doc, it automatically sends that message, that comment to the agent on the transaction. Okay. So if you're going to manually try to send the agent a message, you don't need to. This automatically does it. As long as you have that feature turned on under company settings to automatically send comments to agents on the transaction. Okay. And then I wanted to also mention, this isn't really a mistake, but a lot of times we'll still see people who are typing in email addresses for contacts down here, right? Typing their email address down there, or typing a contact's information into the message instead of just dragging and dropping that person to those two areas. Okay, so definitely want to encourage you to do that. We talk about that all the time. Then you can also see the old webinar that talks about dragging and dropping, but definitely want to encourage you to save that time by dragging instead of typing. Okay, last two areas I wanted to show you are under permissions. Let me head over to a user's profile. Okay, and so sometimes we will see admins give agents the fully managed checklist permission so that they can check off tasks. But we encourage you to not do that for a couple of reasons. One is it can give that user access to tasks that are not theirs. Also, since we've got the fairly new ability for agents to agent check tasks or to indicate that they've completed their tasks both to themselves and to the admins, then there's no need to give them that admin level permission. I'm going to head over to tasks just so you can see what that agent check looks like. If I view all my agent checked and head on over to one of these transactions, right? You see agents have the ability to do this little yellow agent check there instead of a full-on check like that an admin can do, right? So now that they can do that, they check it off. It indicates to themselves that they have checked, they're done with it and can sort of disregard it. And then it indicates to the admin that the agent has completed it, even though the admin still needs to do that full final check. Okay. And last thing I wanted to mention, I won't call this a mistake, but I will mention some people assume that we're here just to help you, which we of course love to do, but we're also here for your feedback. You know, part of the reason we do these webinars, part of the reason we like kind of go the extra mile to make sure that you're super comfortable with what you're doing and giving you perhaps sometimes more information than you even need, is because we want to make sure that the pipeline serves what you need to get done. So in that vein, any feedback that you have, any requests that you have, anything that would help pipeline be better for you, we always appreciate hearing that, and we incorporate that into what we actually build. And that's what makes us feel confident that you're getting what you need. So any feedback that you give is always super welcome. So please be encouraged to do that. Okay. And that's it for common mistakes.